story about lost and found from betrayal in the city to honor on the ranch. Ethan Miller sat at his desk in the downtown office of a mid-sized financial consulting firm in the heart of Chicago. His job was steady, but not particularly exciting. He spent his days crunching numbers, preparing financial reports, and assisting clients with their investment strategies. It wasn't the highest-paying job, but it was enough to support his wife, Clara, and their modest apartment in the city. Ethan had always thought his life was stable, but everything changed one fateful Tuesday afternoon when he got home from work early. He had decided to leave the office early that day. Nothing big, just a personal hunch that he should check on Clara. Their marriage had been 5 years long, and though they had been going through the motions lately, Ethan had never suspected anything amiss. He walked through the front door, removed his shoes, and as he approached their bedroom, he noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear faint sounds from within. His heartbeat quickened as a gut feeling crept up on him. He leaned in closer to the door, his breath caught in his throat. Through the narrow gap, he saw Clara, his beautiful, loving wife, entangled in the sheets with another man. The man's face was unfamiliar, but his presence in their bed felt like a betrayal too deep for words. Ethan stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, processing the shock that was crashing through him. Anger, humiliation, and confusion surged within him, but he didn't act immediately. He didn't confront Clara. Instead, he quietly stepped back and left the apartment, his mind racing. He needed answers, but he also needed control. Ethan walked the quiet streets of the city, aimlessly lost in thought, until he reached a small private investigator's office on the corner of 5th and Maple. He had heard about the firm through a colleague at work, and though he wasn't sure what to expect, he felt a strange sense of relief when he pushed open the door. "Can I help you?" The investigator, a grizzled man with sharp eyes, asked from behind the desk. Ethan hesitated for a moment, then said, "I need someone to follow my wife. I suspect she's been unfaithful." He could barely say the words aloud. The investigator nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I can help you with that. We'll get you the information you need." Ethan spent the next few days in a state of numb disbelief. He kept up his usual routine, going to work and meeting with his friends, all while the investigation into Clara's betrayal quietly unfolded. It was during one of these days, as Ethan drove out of the city for some fresh air, that his life would take another unexpected turn. He was driving down a dusty rural highway when he saw an old couple sitting by the side of the road near a small, weather-beaten ranch. They were arguing about something, their voices carrying on the wind. Curious, Ethan pulled over and approached them. The old man was tall, with deep-set wrinkles on his face, and his wife, though a little frail, had a kind smile. "Can I help you folks with something?" Ethan asked, his voice gentle. The old man looked up, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Ethan. "Well, I don't know. We're in a bit of a jam," he said. "We need a new hand for the ranch, but we don't have much money to pay." Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. "I'm no rancher, but maybe I can help. I'm not looking for money, just something to do." The old man eyed him skeptically, glancing at his wife before replying, "What's the catch?" "We're barely scraping by here." "There's no catch," Ethan said. "I'm going through a personal situation. I just need to keep my mind occupied for a while. I'll work for food." After a brief pause, the old man sighed. "All right, we could use some help. But be warned, it's not easy work. We've got a neighbor, Ranch Westfield, that's been making things difficult for us. They're always trying to push us out, sabotage our property. It's a rough spot, but we'll manage." Ethan agreed without hesitation, and they drove out to the ranch. The ranch was old and weathered, much like the couple, but there was a rustic charm to it. The early mornings on the ranch were brutal. The day started at 5 a.m., with breakfast at 5:30. The work was grueling, starting at 6 a.m., and continued until noon when they took a break for lunch. Afterward, they worked again until sundown. There was a large barn with cows, goats, chickens, and a few horses. They also had a vegetable garden, which kept the couple busy during the off-season. The ranch had a solitary but hard-working vibe. Ethan quickly adapted to the routine, working alongside the couple and learning the ins and outs of the land. The older man, George, was patient in showing him the ropes, especially when it came to fixing fences and herding the cattle. One of the ranch workers, Kyle, was a younger, more rugged man who had been working at the ranch for several years. He was tough and experienced, and he took Ethan under his wing when it came to handling the larger animals and learning how to properly build and maintain the wooden fences. As the days passed, Ethan began to settle into a rhythm. But the tension with the neighboring ranch, Westfield, was growing. The owner of Westfield, a man named Mark Davidson, had been making constant threats and taking actions to harass the elderly couple. Ethan found himself more and more involved in the conflict, trying to help out however he could. One evening, George spoke to him about the history between the two ranches. "We've been here for decades, but Davidson, he's a new player in the area. He wants to expand his land, and he's not afraid to play dirty to get what he wants. But we won't back down." Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself more deeply immersed in the life on the ranch. The hard work was rewarding, but the tension between the two neighboring properties grew more intense. The old couple, George and Carol, seemed weary but resolute in their fight to hold on to their land. The continual sabotage from Westfield Ranch wasn't just a nuisance. It was becoming dangerous. One morning, as Ethan and Kyle were fixing a broken fence near the property line, they noticed something unsettling. A large section of the fence had been torn down, and the cattle from Westfield Ranch had wandered into the old couple's pasture, trampling through their vegetable garden and threatening to cause serious damage to their crops. "Damn it," Kyle muttered under his breath, his weathered face darkening. "This is what I've been telling you about. Davidson's trying to drive us out. This ain't just about land. It's about power. He's making a move." Ethan looked around, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He wasn't used to this kind of confrontation, but something in him had shifted over the past few weeks. His anger toward Clara's betrayal had fueled a desire to take control of the situation. And now, here was a chance to do just that. "We can't let them get away with this," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Let's fix this fence and get the cattle back. But we also need to send them a message. They can't keep treating you this way." Kyle shot him a sideways glance. "I like your fire, but this isn't a simple fix. If we confront Davidson, it might escalate. We'll need a plan." Ethan was no stranger to strategizing. After all, he had been meticulously planning his next steps in his personal life since discovering his wife's infidelity. The situation with Davidson was no different. It required a cool head and careful execution. Later that evening, after a long day of work, Ethan and Kyle sat down with George and Carol. They discussed their options. George, who was normally calm and collected, seemed to be on the edge. "We can't let them keep running over us," George said, his voice steady but tinged with a rare edge of anger. "I've seen too many good people crushed under their greed." Carol, her face pale and tired, added softly, "We've worked this land our whole lives. It's not just about us. It's about what we leave behind, what we've built." Ethan nodded, understanding the weight of their words. He had found his place here, in this tight-knit family, and he wasn't about to let anyone destroy it. "I'll handle Davidson," Ethan said, his resolve hardening. "We'll confront him, but we'll be smart about it. I'll make sure he knows he's not going to get away with this." The plan was set into motion the following week. Ethan rode out to Westfield Ranch to have a friendly conversation with Mark Davidson. The air was thick with tension as he arrived at the sprawling ranch, the harsh wind whipping across the fields. Davidson was a tall man, dressed in expensive tailored cowboy attire, his demeanor as cold as the land he claimed. "What's the problem, Miller?" Davidson asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't belong here. You're just another outsider trying to get involved in things that don't concern you." Ethan held his ground, meeting Davidson's cold stare. "This isn't just about me. It's about the land you're trying to steal and the people you're hurting. I'm not going to let you keep pushing around the Millers." Davidson smirked, clearly unbothered. "I don't know why you think you can change anything. It's over for you. My land's expanding, whether you like it or not." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed calm. "We'll see about that. I'm not backing down, and I'll make sure the authorities know exactly what's been happening here. If you keep crossing the line, there will be consequences." Davidson's expression darkened. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miller. But go ahead. Try to make a move. You'll regret it." As Ethan left Westfield Ranch, the tension in the air seemed to linger. But this confrontation wasn't over. The lines had been drawn, and he was ready to fight for what he had come to care about. Back at the Miller Ranch, things were beginning to take a turn. It had been a few weeks since Ethan's confrontation with Davidson, and while the tension had cooled somewhat, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that things were still far from resolved. But there was another development on the horizon, one that had begun quietly, almost without Ethan realizing it. Ethan had spent more time with Carol and George's daughter Emily, who had recently returned to the ranch after several years away. Emily was in her mid-20s, independent and headstrong, with a fierce protective streak when it came to her family and the ranch. She was nothing like the women Ethan had known before. She wasn't looking for anything from him, and she didn't seem to care about his past or his troubles. At first, Ethan had been wary of her, unsure of how to navigate their interactions. They were both strong-willed, and it often felt like they were clashing at every turn. One day, while working together in the barn, they had a heated argument about the best way to care for the horses. It was a silly thing to fight over, but it sparked something unexpected in both of them. They couldn't seem to agree on anything, yet the friction between them made Ethan feel alive in a way he hadn't in months. Over the next few weeks, their relationship began to evolve, slowly but surely. The tension between them softened as they spent more time together. They still disagreed on plenty of things, but there was a growing respect between them. Ethan found himself drawn to her strength and determination, while Emily began to see a different side of him. The side that wasn't consumed by bitterness or revenge, but one that had a sense of honor and loyalty to those he cared about. One evening, as the sun began to set over the ranch, Ethan found himself standing beside Emily, looking out at the horizon. "You know," he said quietly, "I never imagined I'd end up here. Not like this." Emily glanced at him, her eyes softening. "I never thought I'd come back here either. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing us in the right direction, even when we don't realize it." Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath. "I guess so." And as they stood there, side by side, a spark of something more began to grow between them. As the weeks went by, Ethan found himself more entangled in ranch life, and in his growing relationship with Emily. Their dynamic had shifted. What once had been an unspoken challenge between them had turned into an undeniable connection. But trouble was never far. One evening, as Ethan and Kyle finished repairing the eastern fence, George came riding out to meet them, his face tense. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice grave. Ethan and Kyle exchanged glances before mounting their horses and following George toward the western pasture. As they approached, Ethan's stomach twisted at the sight. Dozens of cattle were missing, and deep tire tracks cut through the mud, leading toward the wooded edge of the property. Kyle clenched his fists. "Davidson, no doubt about it." Ethan exhaled sharply. It was one thing to break fences and intimidate, but outright theft was another level. "We should call the sheriff," Ethan said. George shook his head. "We don't have proof. Sheriff's in Davidson's pocket. We need to catch him in the act." Ethan's jaw tightened. He'd been biding his time, but now Davidson had forced his hand. That night, he devised a plan. If Davidson was bold enough to steal once, he'd do it again. Ethan and Kyle decided to stake out the ranch, hidden in the tall grass, waiting for movement. 3 nights later, their patience paid off. Headlights flickered in the distance, and 2 pickup trucks rolled onto Miller Ranch property. Ethan and Kyle watched as masked men guided more cattle into trailers. Kyle whispered, "We need to stop them." Ethan nodded, gripping the handle of his revolver. "Not yet. Let's follow them first." They tracked the trucks through the dark, keeping their distance until they reached an abandoned barn at the far end of Davidson's land. "This is it," Ethan muttered. Now they had proof. The next morning, Ethan rode into town with Kyle and George, armed with photographs and a plan. They approached Sheriff Wilkins expecting resistance, but when they presented the evidence, clear images of Davidson's men stealing the cattle, the sheriff had no choice but to act. Later that day, Davidson was arrested, and as the news spread, his hold over the town weakened. His men scattered, and for the first time in years, Miller Ranch wasn't under constant threat. Emily watched Ethan from the porch that evening, admiration in her eyes. "You didn't have to do this, you know," she said softly. Ethan met her gaze. "Yeah, I did." Something unspoken passed between them. A shift in the air. She stepped closer, hesitant, then finally let her guard down. For the first time, she let herself believe in him. With Davidson behind bars, Ethan knew it was time to face the last loose end in his life. His wife. He traveled back to the city, stepping into a world that now felt foreign. Clara had been searching for him for months, but he'd avoided her, sending only that one message to a friend. When he arrived at the house they once shared, Clara opened the door, her expression shifting from shock to relief. "Ethan, where have you been?" she whispered. "Doesn't matter," he replied coldly. "I'm here to finalize this." She tried to explain, to justify, but Ethan didn't care anymore. The betrayal had lost its sting. He handed her the divorce papers, signed and sealed. "It's over," he said. "And I don't need an explanation." For the first time in months, he felt free. Ethan returned to the ranch, a weight lifted from his shoulders. Over time, he and Emily grew closer, their relationship deepening in ways neither of them had expected. One day, after saving up enough, Ethan made a bold move. He bought Westfield Ranch. Instead of using it for revenge, he proposed an alliance with George and Carol, merging the lands into one large, thriving operation. At first, George resisted. "That land's been nothing but trouble." But Ethan smiled. "Not anymore. Now it's ours." In the end, George agreed, and together they built something greater than any of them could have imagined. As for Ethan and Emily, their love didn't start easily, but it became something real, something lasting, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan had everything he needed.